Hey guys! Tonight, we're drifting back way back to a time before YouTube, before the internet, before even the concept of plugging something in meant anything. It's time to dim the lights, maybe grab a cup of something warm and sink gently into the marble-scented world of the Romans. Now, I know when people hear Roman Empire, they imagine gladiators, togas, and emperors doing very questionable things with grapes. But honestly, the Romans were more like ancient engineers who just happened to enjoy public executions on the side. These people built stuff that still makes architects shake their heads and mutter, how did they? Tonight, we're talking about Roman technology. Not just the they had roads thing everyone tosses around like a trivia pebble. Real advanced tech, aqueducts, concrete, plumbing you'd actually envy, and machines so clever they'd make a modern engineer squint and go, wait, they had that? So, ya get koozie. This is not a war story. It's a quiet glide through aqueducts, marble dust, and a surprising amount of clever plumbing. Let's begin. The Romans were builders before they were conquerors. Sure, they'd swing swords, when necessary usually quite effectively, but their favorite weapon was infrastructure. Rome didn't just take over land. It absorbed and connected it with a web of stone, water, and calculations so advanced it made empire building look almost effortless. Let's float to the roads, the arteries of their empire. You've heard the cliché, all roads lead to Rome. Turns out, most of them actually did. The first major Roman road, the Via Appia, started around 312 BC. It connected Rome to southern Italy. But calling it a road is underselling it. Imagine a carefully layered system. Stones laid in a bed of gravel and sand, angled for drainage, all fitted together, so tightly you could still walk that thing to millennia later and barely trip. And somehow, this was their early version. Over time, their engineers refined the process, experimenting with materials and slope to make roads that resisted flooding and frost. They even standardized measurements, with milestones marking every Roman mile. Yes, that's where mile comes from. Mil passus, or 1,000 paces. Because of course, it does. And just to make you feel small, by the 2nd century CE, Rome had built over 400,000 kilometers of road. That's about 10 times around the earth. Without bulldozers. Hey guys! Tonight, we're drifting back way back to a time before YouTube, before the internet, before even the concept of plugging something in meant anything. It's time to dim the lights, maybe grab a cup of something warm and sink gently into the marble-scented world of the Romans. Now, I know when people hear Roman Empire, they imagine gladiators, togas, and emperors doing very questionable things with grapes. But honestly, the Romans were more like ancient engineers who just happened to enjoy public executions on the side. These people built stuff that still makes architects shake their heads and mutter, how did they? Tonight, we're talking about Roman technology. Not just the they had roads thing everyone tosses around like a trivia pebble. Real advanced tech, aqueducts, concrete, plumbing you'd actually envy, and machines so clever they'd make a modern engineer squint and go, wait, they had that? So, ya get koozie. This is not a war story. It's a quiet glide through aqueducts, marble dust, and a surprising amount of clever plumbing. Let's begin. The Romans were builders before they were conquerors. Sure, they'd swing swords, when necessary usually quite effectively, but their favorite weapon was infrastructure. Rome didn't just take over land. It absorbed and connected it with a web of stone, water, and calculations so advanced it made empire building look almost effortless. Let's float to the roads, the arteries of their empire. You've heard the cliché, all roads lead to Rome. Turns out, most of them actually did. The first major Roman road, the Via Appia, started around 312 BC. It connected Rome to southern Italy. But calling it a road is underselling it. Imagine a carefully layered system. Stones laid in a bed of gravel and sand, angled for drainage, all fitted together, so tightly you could still walk that thing to millennia later and barely trip. And somehow, this was their early version. Over time, their engineers refined the process, experimenting with materials and slope to make roads that resisted flooding and frost. They even standardized measurements, with milestones marking every Roman mile. Yes, that's where mile comes from. Mil passus, or 1,000 paces. Because of course, it does. And just to make you feel small, by the 2nd century CE, Rome had built over 400,000 kilometers of road. That's about 10 times around the Earth. Without bulldozers, just manpower, geometry, and a level of patience that's almost suspicious. But if roads were the arteries, aqueducts were the veins. And oh, the Romans loved their water. They built aqueducts not just to bring water into cities, but to keep it moving, clean, and dependable, using nothing but gravity and stone. The first one, Aqua Appia, dates back to the same era as their famous road. It was built underground because Romans weren't only good engineers, they were careful ones. They realized that exposed channels could get ruined by sunlight, enemies, or someone's livestock wandering into it. But soon, they grew bolder. If your city was in a valley, or too far from a spring, no problem. They'd build a long stone bridge that gently sloped over miles, keeping water flowing at just the right angle. And we're not talking eyeballed it. Right, they used precise surveying tools, like tichorobates, a wooden leveling frame with a water trough, to measure minuscule gradients. The margin for error, tiny. Too steep, the water would erode the channels. Too flat, it would stagnate. Even modern engineers studied their systems to learn from them. Because these aqueducts, some stretching over 90 kilometers, carried millions of gallons daily into cities like Rome, where the population hit over 1 million at its peak. And what did Romans do with all that water? Baths. So many baths. Public, private, scented, steamy, weirdly social. The bath complex wasn't just hygienate, was civilization wrapped in vapor. You'd go there to exercise, gossip, plot, politics, and occasionally remember that you were supposed to actually wash. Each bath complex had its own plumbing network, powered by lead pipes, the same ones people now use as an example of how their advanced empire poisoned itself. It's true that lead's not great for human health, but the real killer of Rome was political decay, not the plumbing. Still, you can help appreciating the irony that some of the most hygienic people in ancient history were unintentionally sipping lead smoothies with every bath. And baths weren't the only marvels. Some Romans' private homes had running water, fountains, even indoor heating. Jahrhundertflorheating. That thing modern rich people brag about. The Romans casually had it 2,000 years ago. It was called the hypocaust system. Hot air from a furnace flowed under raised floors and through hollow walls, turning entire villas into ancient saunas. Picture a nobleman lounging in his marble atrium, debating philosophy, completely unaware that future generations would still struggle to heat their apartments evenly. Let's drift now to materials. Rome's real magic ingredient was concrete, not the gray, quick-drying stuff that cracks after 3 winters, but a self-healing, volcanic version that's still standing today. They mixed volcanic ash from the region around Naples, mostly pozzolanic dust, with lime and seawater. The result, a chemical reaction so enduring that Roman harbor structures remain intact under the sea after 2,000 years. Modern scientists have literally failed to fully match its brilliance. So yes, that modern overpass that crumbles after 40 years, the Romans are laughing at it. Quietly, from beneath their intact domes. Speaking of domes, the Pantheon, built under Emperor Hadrian around 126 CE, it's still the largest unreinforced concrete dome in the world. Think about that for a second. Every architect learns about it. The oculus, a neat, circular hole in the ceiling, was both symbolic and practical, relieving weight from the structure and letting in sunlight that moves silently around the space like a cosmic clock. And they managed this without computers, cranes, or corded drills, just geometry, math, and the absolute refusal to say, good enough. Let's wander to machinery. The Romans had all sorts of clever devices: water-powered mills, leva cranes, even automatic doors in temples. That last one S. A personal favorite in certain temples of Alexandria and Rome, priests used heated air pressure to open massive bronze doors when offerings were made to the gods. Imagine standing there, watching fire rise, hearing metal hum, and then boom, the doors swing open by divine will. Really, it was just physics and steam. Good branding, though. They also used mechanical gears and valves, like in the Antikythera mechanism found off a Greek island. That one's technically Hellenistic, but Romans understood and applied similar mechanical principles to timekeeping, water management, and, occasionally, party tricks. Wealthy Romans truly enjoyed devices that spat wine, moved statues, or sang through water pipe organs, because why not make your guests mildly uncomfortable while impressing them? It's easy to forget how curious they were not just warriors or politicians. A Roman engineer wasn't just building for utility. They built to showcase capability. Bridges like the Pont du Gard in France combine function and silent aesthetic perfection. Straight lines, geometric arches, and perfectly proportioned columns, they couldn't help themselves. Utility had to be beautiful. Even the drains beneath Rome, the cloaca, maxima, were designed to outlive empires. Started in the Age of Kings. It was still in use long after emperors were dethroned. The world's first large-scale urban sewage system, built from stone, angled perfectly to flush stormwater and waste into the Tiber. Today, remnants are still functional. Rome was literally flushed before most cities existed, and while that sounds mundane, sanitation was revolutionary. For the average Roman, even public toilets were advanced seats lined up side by side, using flowing water beneath to carry waste away. Privacy? None. Hygiene? Better than what medieval Europe would manage over 1,000 years later. As we float through these inventions, it's striking how ordinary many of them were to Romans. For them, heating floors or public plumbing wasn't futuristic, it was just life. That might be the most telling detail of all. Their normal was our advanced. Let's linger on that a bit longer. They lived in a world where hot baths, steamed daily water-crossed mountains under stone arches and concrete domes silently defied gravity. And yet, they never called this technology. To them, it was simply good Roman sense. To make life smoother, cleaner, and practical. Which, incidentally, might be why the empire lasted so long. Empires fall, aqueducts stay. But we're only halfway through the story. The Romans didn't stop at plumbing and concrete. They tinkered, experimented, and occasionally over-engineered just about everything from agriculture to warfare. Let's drift gently into that world next. How the Romans built machines, moved mountains, and somehow made a pre-industrial empire feel strangely modern. Welcome back. Still awake. Or maybe just halfway between consciousness and a cozy nap, which, honestly, is the perfect state for diving deeper into Roman engineering. We've seen their aqueducts and their baths. All very civilized. But how did an empire this huge, stretching from rainy Britain to sunburned Egypt, actually keep itself fed, moved, and surprisingly efficient? It wasn't just luck. Rome had machines, weirdly elegant ones, considering they came from a civilization that still sacrificed goats for divine Wi-Fi. Let's drift into their world of mechanical ambition. The Romans had cranes that could lift tons of marble. Not some experimental prototype, actual, practical machines used daily on construction sites. They were powered by treadmills. Yes, human-sized hamster wheels. Slaves or laborers would walk inside a wooden cylinder, pulling up columns that weighed several tons, and because Romans loved compound solutions, they used pulleys to reduce the force needed. 3 pulleys, 4 moderate lifting, 5 for something insane, and more if you really wanted to defy mortality. One of the more famous crane designs was described by Vitruvius, the ancient world's resident architectural He detailed how levers, ropes, and counterweights worked together with spooky precision. Even more impressively, archaeologists have reconstructed them, and they actually work. It's not theoretical. You could build one today, and it would function almost exactly as described. Picture this. workers assembling a vast Roman temple. The air full of sawdust and shouts in Latin. Giant stone blocks rising almost effortlessly, balanced on ropes and pulleys, as if gravity itself had been politely asked to cooperate. And all of this without steel girders, electricity, or laser levels. Just geometry, sweat, and an understanding of force distribution that rivals early modern physics. Roman engineers weren't mystical geniuses. They were experimental realists. They tried things, observed outcomes, took notes, and crucially scaled success. Speaking of scaling up, the Romans were also masters of water-powered machines. They used water mills along rivers to grind grain, saw wood, and even crush ore. The Barbigal complex in southern France is one of the best examples. Think of it as a second-century industrial park to 16 water wheels, cascading down a slope, connected by channels, each one feeding power to the next. The output, thousands of pounds of flour daily, feeding an entire city. Modern historians call it the greatest known concentration of mechanical power in the ancient world. The Romans just called it a convenient way to avoid paying extra laborers, and they didn't stop at grain in Roman Spain, where silver mining was big business. Engineers funneled entire rivers through wooden pipes and tunnels to wash metal-rich soil. The site at Las Medulas is a prime case. They redirected massive volumes of water, broke apart hillsides, and flushed gold particles down channels. Essentially, hydraulic mining before the term even existed. The technique was called ruina montium, wrecking of mountains, which is about as on-brand as Roman terminology gets. They dam streams, release sudden torrents, and let the force collapse the earth, exposing minerals. Efficient, effective, and catastrophic for the environment. But environmentalism wasn't really trending in first-century Hispania. If we zoom out a bit, you start to sense something fundamental in how Romans approached the world. They saw nature as negotiable. Rivers could be redirected, mountains leveled, and landscapes It wasn't arrogance in the modern sense, more a serene assumption that human order should reshape everything around it. But within that grand-scale engineering, there were also delightful small inventions. Take the Archimedes screw, used to lift water from lower to higher ground. The design technically came from Greek science, but the Romans took it mainstream. Farmers used it to irrigate crops. Miners used it to drain pits. Simple. Elegant. A spiral inside a cylinder, turned by hand or animal power. For a civilization so tied to sandals and stone, Rome was surprisingly automated. Even their military technology reflected that mentality. Their famous siege engines, ballistae and onagars, worked on geometric precision rather than brute chaos. Torsion-powered mechanisms flung stones or darts across massive distances, all thanks to twisted sinew cords, absorbing energy like ancient springs. When you think about it, the Roman army was basically a traveling construction company that occasionally fought people. Each legion carried engineers, surveyors, and craftsmen who built bridges, roads, and siege equipment on-site. Julius Caesar could turn up at a river on Tuesday and have a full wooden bridge crossing it by the weekend. The Rhine Bridge, built in 55 BCE, is a perfect example. Caesar wanted to intimidate Germanic tribes without even fighting them, so he built a massive bridge across the Rhine in just 10 days, purely as a statement. Once his army crossed, he marched back, dismantled it, and left the locals thinking, yeah, maybe we'll stay on this side. No need for battle when your enemy's too stunned by your logistics. And those logistics were astonishing. The Roman military supply system could deliver food, arms, and messages across thousands of kilometers with clockwork efficiency. Relay stations called mutations were set up along roads for courier horses. Messengers could travel more than 50 miles a day, swapping tired animals for fresh ones. To support this, the Romans maintained mansiones, basically ancient motels, where officials could rest, bathe, and have meals while traveling between posts. An empire-wide infrastructure of inns, stables, and workshops. It's the postal system before the postal system, complete with government reimbursements and standardized documentation. Even maps were advanced. The tabula putengeriana, a Roman roadmap stretched over 6 meters long. It displayed the known empire as a network of roads, stations, and distances schematic, not spatially accurate, but wildly practical. You could trace routes like we do on GPS, with handy notes about rest stops. And while we're here, let's talk Roman ships for a moment. The empire was as much about the sea as it was about land. Merchant fleets and war galleys crisscrossed the Mediterranean like delivery drones with oars. Their naves oneraria, cargo ships, could carry up to 400 tons of goods. Massive, slow beasts of commerce, powered by sail and steering. Or port facilities like Ostia, near Rome, were masterpieces of logistics. Artificial harbors, lighthouses, and giant storage warehouses known as horia, built again with that secret recipe of marine concrete. Roman ships had double planking, iron fastenings, and even bilge pumps. Yes, bilge pumps. Think about that. They anticipated one of the most basic mechanisms of marine maintenance that we still use today. There were also early anchors made of lead-filled stone or iron, giving ships balance even during rough seas. Navigation wasn't random either. They used the stars, of course, but also rudimentary devices like the gnomon for measuring latitude from shadow angles. Eventually, they compiled sailing manuals, periploi, describing routes, winds, and port conditions. The Roman sailor might have been superstitious, but he was also surprisingly technical. If you were traveling on the grain route from Alexandria to Rome, you were part of a complex supply machine that kept the empire's stomach full. A single grain ship could feed tens of thousands for a week. Lose one in a storm, and the emperor heard about it. Lose 10, and you had a crisis. So naturally, they built ships strong enough to make the journey even through Mediterranean winters. And back in Rome, the distribution network was no joke. Grain went from ports to riverboats, then to warehouses, 10 tabacerias, all regulated by appointed officials. Romans had a bureaucracy that could make a spreadsheet blush. But not all Roman tech was grand. Some of it was strangely personal and fussy. For instance, they invented stylus pens for writing on wax tablets, essentially an ancient notepad. They also had sundials, small enough to fit in your hand, elaborate locks and keys for doors, and even timed water clocks for tracking speeches, trials, and debates. Yes, ancient Rome had time limits. Senators speaking durations were often regulated by water clocks that slowly drained through a measured hole. When the bowl emptied, so did your permission to talk. You can imagine some senator mid-rant, watching the last drops fall, realizing he's about to be legally silenced by plumbing. If that isn't peak Rome, I don't know what is. Let's take a slower breath here, because all this mechanical brilliance isn't just about gears and stones. It was psychological, too. Rome's innovation came from obsession. An empire determined to order the world, to measure it, control it, and make it function predictably. In some way, it's almost tragic. The same drive that made them build eternal structures also made them unable to stop, always expanding, improving, reorganizing. Perfection through infrastructure. We'll drift deeper in the next stretch to where Roman tech met daily life. The homes, the gadgets, and the quiet domestic marvels that turned luxury into lifestyle. Because it was just emperors and architects who benefited, even ordinary citizens lived inside a web of steady, silent innovation. All right, so we've built the empire, raised bridges, and conquered gravity with But what was all that engineering for? Really? You don't build 400,000 kilometers of road just because you like flat surfaces. No. All those marvels existed so Romans could live their best lives, or at least the rich ones could. Tonight, let's glide through Roman life itself. The homes, the little gadgets, the everyday technologies that made ordinary existence quietly convenient. To start, let's visit a Roman domus, a typical upper-class townhouse. Above the door might hang a bronze knocker shaped like a lion's head. Once inside, you'd step into the atrium, flooded with light from an open roof called the compluvium. Rainwater slipped through that square opening and fell neatly into a marble basin below the impluvium, which doubled as a decorative feature and a water source. This system wasn't just pretty. It collected clean water before aqueduct pipes ever touched the city. It was sustainability before the floors were mosaics, made of thousands of tiny tiles, or tesserae, arranged into images of gods, animals, or whatever status symbol the homeowner wanted to show off. The wealthier you were, the finer the detail. Some homes even had walls painted with scenes of faraway gardens or Greek myths, a trick to make confined spaces feel bigger, basically ancient 3D wallpaper. Lighting was another quiet masterpiece. Instead of bulky torches, Romans used small oil lamps made from clay or bronze. They had multiple spouts and adjustable wicks, subtle, customizable lighting, centuries before electricity. And while the smoke probably made ceilings look like the inside of a barbecue pit, it gave those amber, soft glows that modern designers now call ambient lighting. They even had portable lamps for evening strolls, like ancient lanterns with handles. So, yes, Romans were carrying mood lighting before Instagram aesthetics made it mainstream. Heating, we've mentioned. But let's stretch that image. Imagine lying on a mosaic floor, feeling a gentle warmth rising beneath your bare feet. No smoke inside, no ash to clean up, just quiet, even radiant heat drifting through your villa. The system burned wood or charcoal in a furnace below ground, sending hot air through hollow tiles to heat rooms or baths above. The engineering precision was so good that some villas in Britain, Chile, Great Britain, stayed toasty through the winter. The Romans brought sunshine underground. Now, temperature control's great, but what about comfort elsewhere? Enter Roman furniture. Lighter than you might expect, mostly wooden frames with intricate bronze fittings. Beds were often adjustable, couches were multi-purpose. You'd dine, lounge, and discuss poetry all from the same piece of furniture. Tables had folding legs for easy movement, and chairs occasionally featured curved designs for ergonomic comfort. Interior design. Minimalist but intentional. They loved symmetry, not in a neurotic way, just enough to keep the eye relaxed. Frescoes of marine scenes were common, because the Romans loved illusionist art. Ordinary walls became portals to seashores or gardens. Even their sense of relaxation had a clever geometry. But what really brought the Roman home to life was water. Running water. We'd like to credit Victorian engineers, but ancient Romans had pressurized systems to millennia earlier. Using lead or bronze pipes, water flowed up into houses through siphon pressure. No pumps needed. They had faucets, basins, even indoor fountains, gurgling in courtyards. Some homes had what we'd call luxury bathrooms, marble bathtubs with hot and cold water controls. You could wash yourself privately, then go to the public baths for the social part of hygiene. The public baths, the thermae, were almost cities in themselves. Giant marble complexes featuring hot pools, cold pools, steam rooms, gyms, lecture halls, and gardens. There were even snack vendors. Imagine your local spa crossed with a gym and a cafe, except everyone's in a toga and someone's probably discussing Cicero in the corner. Hot air flowed under the floors, warm water steamed constantly, and attendants regulated temperatures with careful precision. To modern ears, it sounds decadent, and it was, but it was also deeply communal. Daily hygiene was civic duty and leisure intertwined. Let's drift now into smaller innovations. Everyday tools were quietly ingenious. Roman glassware, for example, was advanced enough to include double-walled vessels that kept drinks cool longer, ancient thermoses. Essentially, glassblowing had been refined to an art. Translucent bottles, flasks, and jars filled every household. For writing, they used wax tablets and styluses, but they also developed ink pens and parchment scrolls for serious work. Books, or rather early notebooks, were made by binding thin wooden leaves with wax tied together with leather strings. And yes, students doodled on them. Some survive, complete with what are likely the world's oldest examples of board school notes. Even Roman kitchen gadgets were clever. Rotary mills ground flour, bronze sieves, and graters processed food. Portable stoves and clay ovens gave them mobility. Soldiers cooked on miniature versions while on campaign. Kitchens were ventilated, and larger villas sometimes had servants dedicated just to heating wine to the perfect lukewarm temperature. And their cutlery. Fork-like utensils existed, but mostly they used spoons and knives. Fingers were completely acceptable tools, though table manners came later. The Romans were more about eating in style than worrying about crumbs. One of the strangest little devices was a curved metal scraper used after bathing to remove sweat, dirt, and oil. Think of it like a body squeegee. They paired it with a perfumed oil rub, which means even laborers often walked out of baths smelling like luxury brands of the 1st century. Let's step out from homes for a bit and stroll through the streets of Rome. Urban planning itself was part of the technology. The city grid, inherited from military camps, was precise, perpendicular streets, drainage channels, and paved stones slightly convex to help rain run off. And the Romans being Romans, they carved stepping stones into intersections so you could cross without getting your sandals soaked. Traffic flowed between them. Chariots, carts, pedestrians, in a rhythm that would look shockingly familiar to any modern city. Street lighting wasn't electrical, but torches and oil lamps hung from doorways gave a dim, flickering glow. Night patrols, known as the vigils, doubled as firefighters. Because, well, a city built mostly of wood and ambition caught fire often. They carried water buckets, axes, and hooks, patrolling districts like an ancient night shift security team with hoses. Their firefighting tools were surprisingly advanced. The sipho, a kind of manual water pump, could project water streams onto flames. Fire stations even had dormitories for men on watch, essentially the first organized public service squads. Meanwhile, beyond the city, rural estates, biae rusticae, were miniature factories. Windmills weren't common yet, but water wheels powered grain mills, olive oil presses, and irrigation channels. Agricultural treatises by writers like Columella and Varro show that Roman farmers thought in systems. Drainage ditches, crop rotation, and mechanical presses, all early prototypes of efficient Speaking of presses, olive oil technology deserves a quiet nod. The Roman screw press was a marvel of leverage, wooden beams, threaded shafts, and weights, squeezing ripe olives until golden liquid trickled out. If you've ever drizzled olive oil on bread, you've basically tasted Roman engineering tradition. And while farming machinery might sound mundane, it fed the empire, literally powering Rome's breadbasket from North Africa and Sicily right to the imperial capital. The logistics of that grain supply were astonishing. Warehouses called horia stored thousands of tons of grain, with ventilation ducts to prevent rot and pests. The Annona system regulated prices to keep the city calm, because hungry citizens had this inconvenient habit of starting revolts. So yes, Roman bureaucracy might be slow, but it knew how to keep riots away with bread. This brings us neatly to Roman trade networks. Their merchant fleets crisscrossed the sea year-round, carrying amphorae, tall clay jars filled with wine, oil, garum that fermented fish sauce no one wants to smell, and luxury imports like silk from China. Trade routes reached as far as India and sub-Saharan Africa. Roman coins have been found in remote harbors around the Arabian Sea. Those little copper discs were their credit system, and surprisingly stable ones at that. At least until inflation joined the imperial decline later. Even shipwrecks along the Mediterranean seafloor preserve the technology of their cargo management. Amphorae stacked in geometrically perfect layers, balanced by lead anchors and stone ballast, the ancient equivalent of shipping container optimization. All this technology served one central Roman idea: order. The world must be organized, measured, and manageable. Yet under that rigid logic was an empire that quietly adored leisure. Engineering and pleasure weren't opposites. They were inseparable. So while aqueducts honored necessity, villas honored indulgence. The same scientific precision that calculated arch symmetry also brought hot baths, chilled wine, and indoor fountains splashing beside couches. It was luxury designed with math. Let's float forward once more in our calm little current into the mechanical wonders built purely for entertainment. Because no great empire, however practical, could resist showing off a bit. Still with me. Is still with me. Nice lays drift into Rome at her loudest. And, paradoxically, her most technical phase. The empire wasn't content with keeping people fed, clean, and comfortable. No, it had to entertain them too, massively, extravagantly, and with machinery that would make a Renaissance inventor blush. The Colosseum, you've seen the pictures, maybe even stood inside its skeleton of stone and shadow. But the real marvel wasn't just the architecture, it was what happened underneath. Beneath that massive arena floor sat a labyrinth of pulleys, lifts, and trapdoors called the hypogeum. Picture this: wooden elevators powered by human muscle, hoisting cages of lions or gladiators up through the floor. A lever creaks, a platform rises, and suddenly, surprise, there's a leopard in your afternoon entertainment. Dozens of these mechanisms worked in perfect coordination, all managed manually. No steel, just ropes, counterweights, and sheer It was ancient stagecraft of the highest order. Some accounts even describe entire sets, forests, ships, temples, appearing and disappearing mid-show. And yes, they could flood it. The Romans could actually turn the Colosseum into a temporary lake for naval reenactments. Or they built hidden channels that fed water from aqueducts directly into the arena, sealed by waxed barriers. Boats floated in. Mock-sea battles raged. And then, somehow, they drained it all again, because why not recreate a naval war in your sports venue? That's Roman energy. Their theaters were just as innovative. Semicircular amphitheaters featured acoustics so precise that you could whisper on stage and still be heard in the back row. Stone steps reflected sound waves upward. Curtains rose and fell using gears and counterweights pulled by hidden crews. They even had retractable awnings, vast canvas shades. The velarium stretched over the seats using rope systems managed by sailors from the Navy. Yes, the same professionals who managed rigging on ships were recruited to handle the stadium roofs, and just to make sure everyone stayed comfortable. Clever architects left gaps between seating tiers for wind to flow through. Passive climate control. Ancient edition. If all this sounds extravagant, it's because it was. The Romans adored the theatrical, not just in art, but in technology. They didn't separate spectacle from engineering. They merged them. Even their celebrations of power were mechanical. During triumphal parades, huge floats rolled through the city, carrying statues rotated by hidden axles, costumes lifted by gears, and fountains of colored liquid bubbling through tubes. The city turned itself into a living machine of civic pride. But, quietly, beneath all that golden marble showmanship, the same intelligence fueling the spectacle was beginning to flicker. Let us hover for a moment at the turning point around the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, when Rome's empire was sprawling and its innovations started repeating themselves. You see, the Romans were brilliant builders, but cautious inventors. They preferred perfecting the known over exploring the unknown. When something worked, a concrete formula, a bridge plan, a bot layout, they copied it across continents. Standardization was their obsession. Efficiency through sameness. It was comfortable, but secretly dangerous. Because over time, curiosity slowed down. Experimentation turned into tradition. Those magnificent aqueducts kept running, but few new ones appeared in the later centuries. And while the empire flexed its muscles in battles and monuments, scientific curiosity shifted from workshop to rhetoric. Philosophers debated ideal forms. Engineers stuck to manuals written by ancestors long gone. Vitruvius, that old architecture master, became scripture to be revered, not questioned. Still, that culture of practicality lingered in small ways. Roman physicians continued using fine surgical instruments, scalpels, forceps, bone saws, and catheters, all made from bronze or iron. The designs were so effective that 19th century surgeons would still recognize half of them. Hospitals existed to the valetudinaria for soldiers and workers, with organized wards and sanitation standards unheard of elsewhere. Even here, though efficiency was about empire maintenance, not humanitarianism. Soldiers healed faster, empires lasted longer. The same mindset appeared in Roman timekeeping. The public sundial, a civic essential, evolved into the water clock and eventually the clepsydra, measuring time by the steady drip of liquid through calibrated vessels. At night, You told time by how far the water had fallen. Monks in later centuries inherited that exact idea. Rome's urban nightscape, surprisingly, even extended to street services. Vendors sold food late into the evening wine, hot chickpeas or honey pastries, and taverns spilled lamplight onto basalt roads. If you skint, you could almost mistake it for a low-lit modern city. Flickering lights, chatter, the faint hum of machinery somewhere deep beneath the surface. By the late Empire, though the great machines of comfort and spectacle began fading, aqueducts dried in some provinces from neglect. Lead pipes, roads cracked under the weight of too many campaigns and too few repairs. The Empire's greatest invention. Maintenance simply ran out of money and manpower. And yet, the remnants lingered. Medieval monasteries later copied Roman water wheels. Byzantine architects reused Roman concrete formulas. Even the Islamic caliphates studied translated Roman manuals on engineering to power their golden age. Rome didn't vanish. It diffused. Still, if you stood on a hill overlooking a crumbling Roman city around 500 CE, weeds creeping through marble, broken statues staring at nothing, you wouldn't think of diffusion. You'd just hear silence where water once flowed. The hum of the world's greatest engine had stopped. Let's not end quite yet on ruins, though, because in truth, Rome's brilliance was never just technological. It was philosophical, a blend of logic and hubris. Machines served status, but also identity. To be Roman meant mastering your environment, to pave, plumb, measure, and build as if permanence was divine right. Every brick, every arch, every dome whispered the same thought, "'Tis we last," and in some tired, poetic way. It did. Their roads became Europe's highways. Their aqueducts fed new towns centuries later. Their language built modern law and science. Even in our age of phones and fiber optics, you can trace our daily comforts, heating, plumbing, civil planning straight back to those marble corridors and smoky lamps. Think of it. The soft warmth beneath your floor, the tap water in your kitchen, the city grid outside, all quiet echoes of Roman logic. The empire may have fallen, but its algorithms never stopped running. Their world was powered not by electricity, but imagination anchored in geometry. And maybe, taught us the gentlest truth of Rome's technology. It was anti-futuristic. By accident, it was optimistic by design. So, tonight, as you drift toward sleep, remember these. The next time your Wi-Fi cuts out, somewhere a Roman engineer is shaking his head from the afterlife, muttering something about aqueducts never losing signal. Sleep well, citizen of the modern empire. Rome's still humming in the background. Again now we're gliding into the golden haze of ancient Constantinople, where the streets smelt like incense, ambition, and maybe just a little too much donkey traffic. This is not a fairy tale, although it has all the right ingredients. Poverty, performance, scandal, an emperor deeply in denial about his feelings, and, of course, a woman who climbed from the gutter to the throne, all while being judged by men who couldn't hold a candle to her intelligence. Settle in. Lights low. Maybe a cup of tea in hand. We're going to meet Theodora, Empress of the Byzantine Empire. Once a child actress, an entertainer, a survivor of some truly grim circumstances, she became one of the most powerful women in the ancient world. And she did it with poise, politics, and weaponized charm. Now, when I say actress, don't imagine modern theater. In the early 6th century, that term was ... flexible. Stage performance and dance were tangled with social scandal. Let's say respectable women weren't exactly encouraged to pursue it. But Theodora didn't have the luxury of respectability. She was born around the year 500, probably in Constantinople, though some sources argue for Cyprus. Her father, Acacius, worked as a bearkeeper in the city's hippodrome. Yes, bearkeeper, actual wild animals. Not a glamorous job, but one with a front row seat to the city's endless chariot races and political feuds. When Acacius died, Theodora's mother tried to keep his job for one of her daughters, dressing them up and parading them through the hippodrome in front of the public, pleading with the crowd for sympathy. It must have been both heartbreaking and a little humiliating. 3 girls in threadbare tunics, bowing before drunk fans of rival racing factions, begging for their livelihood back. The crowd said no. So, Theodora's mother did what resourceful women often did in ancient cities. She turned survival into performance. The girls joined the world of entertainers, actors, comedians, dancers. For context, this world was more nightclub than theater, more scandal than art. And yet, young Theodora had a gift presence. She learned how to read an audience, how to control a room, how to make people want her or fear her, sometimes both. Sources like Procopius, the eternal gossip columnist of Byzantine history, painted her as scandalous beyond belief. His secret history is filled with exaggerated details about her alleged performances and morals, clearly meant to humiliate her. So, naturally, historians read it with both fascination and caution, because behind his venom, there's a pattern. Every description of her scandal comes paired with grudging admiration. She was sharp, quick-witted, and dangerously confident, which, for 6th century Constantinople, was about as threatening as heresy. By her teenage years, Theodora had become part of the city's low-tier celebrity circuit. She charmed wealthy patrons, and performed in shows where humor came dipped in innuendo. It is hard to separate myth from fact. The surviving accounts reek of elite male discomfort, but what is certain is that she worked her way from obscurity into the notice of powerful men, before walking away from it all. At some point she left Constantinople behind, traveling east possibly to North Africa. There, her life took a quieter, darker turn. She converted to a stricter form of Christianity, found work spinning wool, and, if we believe later accounts, endured years of hardship and introspection. That's the thing about Theodora. She wasn't just ambitious, she was adaptable. She could rule the city stage one year and disappear into desert poverty the next. Every setback became a survival lesson. By her early 20s, she returned to Constantinople a changed person, still radiant, still compelling, but now disciplined, reflective, and, dare I say, politically dangerous. And then she met Justinian. He wasn't emperor yet, just the nephew of Emperor Justin I. Clever, calculating, and a bit socially awkward. But behind that mild appearance was a man with enormous ambition and not much interest in the usual noblewomen. Theodora was utterly outside his world, but that didn't stop him. It probably intrigued him. The two met sometime around 522. No one knows the exact circumstances, but it's easy to picture. Justinian, a statesman who spent more time with theology than humans, encountering a woman who could match him word for word. He was smitten. There was just one problem: Roman law. Performers and former actresses were legally forbidden to marry high officials, but Justinian wasn't the type to let paperwork stop him. He changed the law. Literally. The emperor, his uncle, agreed to pass a decree allowing such marriages for reasons of virtue, which, in plain language, meant Justinian wants Theodora, and we're all pretending it's moral philosophy. By 525, they were married. Two complex personalities, a brilliant administrator and a woman the establishment didn't quite know how to handle. Together, they'd rule an empire. At her coronation in 527, Theodora stood beside Justinian, not as a silent consort, but as his official pronouncements were issued in both their names. Her influence was baked into policy, and she understood something Justinian didn't: how people worked. He was a visionary who dreamed of restoring Rome's glory. She was a realist who knew how fragile power could be. Together, they made one of history's strangest, sharpest political partnerships. But she never forgot where she came from. Theodora stayed fiercely protective of women's rights, passing laws against forced prostitution and sheltering women escaping abuse. Some of this was moral reform, but much of it was personal. She'd lived that world. Let's pause for a moment here. Picture her, the girl once mocked in the Hippodrome, now standing under its massive arches, crowned in gold and surrounded by senators who used to sneer at her name. Theodora had done what? No actress, no outsider, no woman from the lower classes had ever done. She had climbed atop the Byzantine hierarchy and turned gossip into governance. And somehow, she kept her poise doing it. Still, as with everything in imperial politics, peace didn't last. Because power in Byzantium was less a throne and more a balancing act on a knife edge, Theodora and Justinian would soon face the greatest crisis of their reign: riots, massacres, and a near collapse of the empire itself. It would be Theodora's voice that saved the crown when steel and strategy failed. Let's drift softly into that moment next, where empires burned and one former actress decided she'd rather die a queen than run as a commoner. Hey again? Still awake? That's impressive, because now we're drifting into the darker, smokier middle act of Theodora's story, the part where everything technically fell apart, but she refused to. By 532, Theodora and Justinian had been ruling for a few years. The empire was wealthy, reforming fast, and filled with discontent, which is pretty much the Byzantine default setting. Justinian's tax policies had made enemies out of almost everyone who could afford silk, while Theodora's sharp intelligence made enemies out of everyone else. But even busy emperors and ambitious empresses had to deal with one unstoppable force of nature: chariot racing fans. Constantinople wasn't just a capital, it was obsessed. The city's main entertainment came from the Hippodrome, a massive racing arena that doubled as a political parliament with fewer rules and more shouting. Fans were divided into two main factions: the Blues and the Greens. They started as sports clubs, but over time became full-blown political identities. Think modern soccer hooliganism, but with more theology and horses. Theodora's father had worked for the Greens. Justinian favored the Blues. And in a city where faction loyalty often meant the difference between a promotion and prison, that division mattered. Now, imagine the setup. A packed hippodrome, thousands of chanting fans, nobles pretending to like the commoners, guards twitching at every cheer. Add years of simmering tension, and then a badly managed execution. In January 532, several members of both factions were arrested after a street fight. Two prisoners, one blue and one green, escaped and sought sanctuary in a church. The crowd demanded their release. Justinian refused. Bad choice. Bad choice. The next race day, the crowd united Blues and Greens together, which was like cats and dogs suddenly agreeing to overthrow your government. As the races began, instead of chanting for their colors, the crowd roared a single word: Nick, which meant conquer. It was less encouragement and more a call for insurrection. Wheaten oars. The city exploded. Mobs set fires, broke into prisons, freed captives, and stormed through the marble streets. The flames ate through markets, palaces, even part of the Hagia Sophia. The emperor's palace was literally surrounded. In the chaos, senators who hated Justinian's reforms saw an opportunity and secretly backed the rioters, proposing a replacement emperor from a noble family. It was a genuine siege, inside the palace, outside an inferno. Justinian panicked, and honestly, fair enough. His closest advisors urged him to flee by sea. He could have easily done it: grab Theodora, sail for safety, regroup later. Most emperors would have done just that. Most empresses, too. But not this one. While Justinian and his generals argued in a flickering room, Theodora stood up. Ancient historians preserved her exact words, or at least the dramatic version of them, and even accounting for the usual exaggeration. It's one of the boldest speeches ever given in imperial history. She said, "If flight were the only path to safety, we could take it. But for one who has been an emperor, it is unworthy to be in exile. Royalty is an excellent burial shroud. In gentler words, I'd rather die on the throne than live as a refugee." The room went silent. Here was a woman who had once hustled on the streets, who had begged in the hippodrome, now telling generals and clerics what it meant to have a spine. That moment redefined her completely. Justinian looked at her, perhaps realizing she was braver than anyone in the room. Then, quietly, he decided not to run. Instead, He plotted. With Theodora Spakin, he sent his top general Belisarius to deal with the riot the Roman way, decisively and brutally. The next day Belisarius and a fellow commander, Mun, sealed both exits of the hippodrome, where the rebel mob had gathered to crown their new emperor. Soldiers, march it in. What followed wasn't a fight, it was a purge. Reports estimate up to 30,000 people were killed inside that arena. The streets ran silent afterward. By nightfall, the rebellion was over. Justinian stayed on his throne. Theodora stood beside him, her poise cold and steady amid the wreckage of her birth city. And from that moment forward, everyone, from court officials to foreign ambassadors, understood something fundamental about her. She wasn't a side piece. She was the empire's willpower in human form. Let's linger for a moment on what that meant. Most ancient empresses existed in the margins, ceremonial figures, mothers of heirs, decorative extensions of dynastic order. Theodora refused that template. After Nika, she attended high-level councils, drafted decrees, and personally received on. In mosaics, she appears beside Justinian, standing equal, each hallowed like saints. Those weren't symbolic gestures. Her name was literally written on imperial laws. She intervened in church disputes, settled theological arguments, and much to the horror of conservative bishops, pushed for compromises between feuding Christian sects. Historians often call Justinian the administrator of Byzantium's body. Theodora, they say, was its brain. But for all her strength, life in the palace wasn't necessarily comfortable. The political world of Constantinople seethed with intrigue. Generals resented her influence, courtiers whispered. Outside, ordinary citizens remembered the slaughter. Theodora's enemies circulated rumors endlessly. The old stories about her former past resurfaced like propaganda weeds. It was gossip weaponized into politics. Procopius, yes, that eternal gossip historian again, published his secret history years later, calling her demon-like, accusing her of manipulating Justinian, and of every sin under the Byzantine sun. What he said, perhaps deliberately, was her argument for reform. She used her influence to close brothels and set up safe shelters for women, known as the House of Repentance. It wasn't a moral crusade. It was about dignity. Her laws increased property rights for women and imposed death penalties for trafficking. Harsh, perhaps, but rooted in personal rage at exploitation. Even Justinian, for all his brilliance, didn't always agree with her. They clashed, quietly, behind gilded doors. He leaned toward theological perfectionism. She leaned toward realism. He thought in decrees, she thought in damage control. And while the Nika revolt had ended decisively, it left scars. The capital was half burnt, thousands dead, revenues ruined, and both of them were haunted by what survival had cost. But survival was also transformation. From those ashes, the empire rebuilt itself, grander, older, sinier, as if to deny that anything had ever gone wrong. The new Hagia Sophia rose soon after a massive dome of light and geometry, designed so sunlight floated like divine mist across its marble floor. When Justinian entered it upon completion, he reportedly exclaimed, "Solomon, I have outdone you." You can almost imagine Theodora looking up at that dome, serene, knowing full well what it had taken to build it. Beneath the mosaics and incense, she'd buried 1,000 ghosts from the hippodrome. But she never said a word. Instead, she kept ruling. Quietly, precisely. Sometimes merciful, sometimes merciless, depending on what survival required. Her health, though, began to fail. Sources describe long absences from public view, her energy dimming by the early 540s. Some say she suffered from cancer. Others suggest exhaustion. What matters is, she kept working until she physically couldn't. By 548, she died, still empress, still Justinian's equal, at around 48 years old. Her husband never he ruled another 17 years, but was never quite the same. She was buried in the Church of the Holy Apostles, under golden domes, the city quiet at last around her. It's hard not to picture her there. The bear-keeper's daughter, the performer, the riot survivor, turned savior of the empire, resting among marble emperors, her name still whispered by chroniclers who couldn't decide whether to admire or envy her. But this story isn't over just yet. Because what Theodora left behind wasn't just reputation, it was legacy law, myth, and a strange echo through the centuries of women who dared to rule. Let's drift gently into that next. All right, last stretch. Let's drift a little further through the candlelight, into the quieter part of Theodora's story, the part that begins after she has gone, when myths start doing what myths always do, twisting memory into meaning. When Theodora died in 548, her funeral was an imperial event, solemn, glittering, heartbreak wrapped in ritual. The emperor walked behind her coffin, silent. There are no letters from Justinian to her, no diary entries, no confessions. Byzantine rulers didn't do personal vulnerability in public, but everything that happened in the years after her death reads like mourning in disguise. He built more churches, more monuments, expanded laws he'd started. You can almost trace her ghost in the marble corridors of Constantinople, a voice that kept whispering even when its owner was long gone. Let's glide through that legacy. Slowly. One of the first places she lives on is law itself. Theodora's push for women's protection didn't vanish with her death. Justinian's Corpus Juris Civilis, the great compilation of Roman law, includes sections referencing the reforms she inspired, detailing rights for abandoned wives, limits on forced prostitution, harsher penalties for abusers. That's the thing about Theodora. She carved her empathy into paper and stone. The empire's bureaucracy could erase names, but not precedent. Generations later, legal scholars across Europe would study Byzantine law, unknowingly echoing her work. And beyond law, she left something stranger, an image. If you've ever seen her in mosaic, in Ravenna's Basilica of San Vitale, you know what I mean. She stands in shimmering glass tiles, a chalice in hand, flanked by attendants, glowing with regal stillness. Her face is long, deliberate, unreadable. The artist didn't soften her or try to romanticize her. She looks like someone who has seen every disappointment and turned them all into posture. What's wild is that she probably never visited Ravenna in person. That mosaic isn't portraiture. It's an icon, a declaration of who she meant to be, eternal, untouchable, sanctified through symmetry. Justinian's panel stands across from hers, and together they stare forever into the apse, two rulers face to face in glass eternity. In a way, that's the perfect metaphor for them. Separate, equal, joined by empire, but isolated in reflection. He got sainthood in the Orthodox Church. She didn't. She was too complicated for that. Still, some Orthodox traditions treat her as righteous Theodora, protector of women. It's a quiet vindication for a woman medieval chroniclers once painted as sinful. Now, centuries later, her story reads almost cinematic. A rags to regalia arc people still can't quite categorize. To some, she's the ultimate survivor story. To others, she's proof that ambition, when sharpened by hardship, can move worlds. But maybe her real legacy was showing what power looks like when filtered through pain. She never pretended imperial life made her happy. She simply managed it better than anyone else could. She and Justinian ruled during what we now call the Byzantine Golden Age, the high noon of Eastern Rome. They codified law, built monuments, redefined governance, and almost reunited the entire Roman world. But beneath all that achievement was exhaustion. The cost of empire is rarely gold. Its people. Theodora knew that before anyone else around her. She had grown up watching crowds cheer and forget, rise and burn. She understood that public love was temporary. But legacy, real legacy, required control. So she mastered the art of narrative. She told her own story through policy, through architecture, through her refusal to vanish politely when men told her to. She turned every insult into currency. Even the writers who tried to ruin her reputation accidentally immortalized her. Procopius thought the secret history would destroy her image. Instead, it made her legend Theodora suddenly became the eternal paradox. Saint or schema, sinner or emancipator, depending on who you asked. Western chroniclers centuries later couldn't decide which version to use. Artists adored her scandal, Feminists admired her nerve. There was no single Theodora left, only reflections of what each era needed her to represent. Let's drift, for a moment, into the city that outlasted her. Constantinople, her stage, her empire, her final witness. After her death, it thrived for another 900 years, transforming, fracturing, and rebuilding through siege and splendor. The walls she walked beside, the palace corridors she commanded, even the beds she might have designed, all survived waves of fire and conquest. And still, her name clings to them, whispered by guides, carved in faded letters, somewhere between myth and memory. We can trace her echoes further west to the chronicles of medieval queens, like Eleanor of Aquitaine or Catherine de' Medici, are filled with subtle fragments of her archetype, the powerful consort who becomes indispensable, the woman dismissed until she's suddenly making history. You can almost hear Byzantium breathing through them. And then there's modern history, which, of course, loves a comeback. Theodora has re-emerged every few decades, alternating between feminist icon and misunderstood villain. Each generation rediscovers her, then promptly argues about her morals. It's what she would have wanted. Honestly, because to Theodora, lasting power wasn't about universal admiration. It was about relevance, still being discussed 15 centuries later. That's about as close to immortality as history allows. If you stand close to her mosaic, say, in Ravenna, where the light filters softly through high windows, you'll notice something odd. The gold tiles behind her shimmer differently from Justinian's panel across the apse. His background gleams steadily, almost stately. Hers flickers like moving water. It's a trick of the angle, maybe, or just artistic coincidence, but it feels right. Theodora doesn't stand still. Her image moves, reflects, deflects. She's always alive in the act of interpretation, half queen, half enigma. Let's let her story fade out gently here. Like the last chord of an old Byzantine hymn, a girl born in the noise of the circus, a woman crowned in the silence of the basilica, an empress who stared down riots, rewrote laws, and made her name outlast marble itself. Maybe she wasn't virtuous, maybe she wasn't nice, but she was unforgettable. And maybe, just maybe, in every glass shard of her mosaic, you can still see the shimmer of someone who refused to stay where history told her she belonged. So, tonight, if you find yourself thinking about what power really means, not glory, not fame, just the raw will to endure, remember Theodora, the bearkeeper's daughter, the empress, the icon no one could erase. Sleep well. Constantinople is quiet now, but she's still awake. Now we're heading back to medieval Europe, the land of endless crusades, aggressively religious knights, and surprisingly messy paperwork about who owned which icy bit of forest. Our story tonight begins with the Teutonic Order, the most organized, disciplined, and unintentionally terrifying band of monks with swords you could ever imagine. They were supposed to protect pilgrims and do charitable work. They ended up running a military empire. As one does, if you think the Knights Templar were mysterious or the Hospitallers were noble, the Teutonic Order was that third sibling in the back quietly planning world domination through spreadsheets, military discipline, and aggressive real estate. Let's set the scene. It's the late 12th century. Europe is tangled in Crusader fever. Every noble family has a crusade nephew, the one who sold half the estate to win back the Holy Land and, spoiler alert, didn't. The Holy Roman Empire was still trying to prove how holy and Roman it actually was. Germany, meanwhile, was a confusing quilt of duchies and principalities, each with more pride than population. Somewhere between religious zeal and boredom, the Teutonic Order of the Hospital of St. Mary of Jerusalem was born. You can see why everyone just called them the Teutonic Knights. They started modestly in Acre, one of those glittering port cities of the Crusader states. In 1190, during the siege of Acre, a group of German merchants set up a field hospital for wounded crusaders. A noble cause. It wasn't glamorous, but they were saving lives in a war zone filled with dust, steel, and far too many pious speeches. Soon, like every medieval charity that starts well, it escalated. The hospital turned into a brotherhood. The brotherhood took vows. The vows came with uniforms, long white cloaks with a black cross, simple and theatrical, which is the right combination for medieval branding. And because monks and bureaucrats can never resist organization, they sought papal approval. In 1198, Pope Innocent III officially recognized them as a military order. And that's when things got ... less nursing, more conquering. Let's float through the early days. The order combined the structure of monastic life with the efficiency of a professional army. Members took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Though, in fairness, chastity for some Crusader knights was often flexible. They fought shoulder to shoulder with the Templars and Hospitallers in the Holy Land, guarding pilgrims and garrisons, but they were German to the core. Methodical, ambitious, quietly keeping ledgers, even as arrows flew, while the Templars hunted relics and the Hospitallers managed hospitals. The Teutonic Knights had a slightly different energy. They wanted territory. Real, snow-covered, defensible territory. And fate, or maybe just Europe's general chaos, handed them exactly that opportunity. Flash forward to the early 13th century. The Crusader dream is running out of steam. Jerusalem's long-lost acre is wobbling. The knights are fading into a... But then, from the chilly north, comes a divine job posting. Christianize the pagan lands of the Baltic. You see, while Western Europe was busy with crusades in the desert, the northern edges, places like Prussia, Livonia, and Estonia, were still cheerfully pagan. These weren't polite pagans either. They raided neighbors, roasted Christian merchants, and had gods who demanded inconvenient things, like animal sacrifices and, occasionally, enemies. Enter Duke Conrad of Masovia, a Polish ruler with a problem. His lands bordered these stubbornly pagan... They kept raiding his villages. He couldn't stop them. So, logically, he outsourced the job. He invited the Teutonic Knights to come north, settle in his lands, and deal with the pagans. Now, this is where you should always read the fine print of knightly contracts, because the Teutonic Knights didn't come as temporary soldiers. They came as professional conquerors with long-term housing plans. By 1230, Te Signet, what is known as the Golden Bull of Rimini, an impressive-sounding document that basically gave them permission from the Holy Roman Emperor to rule any lands they could convert, which is medieval Latin for take by force, and call it God's will. So the Teutonic Knights packed up from the Holy Land, stopped pretending to care about sand, and headed for the freezing forests of the Baltic coast. And from there our story shifts from dusty deserts to icy rivers, from Jerusalem's minarets to pine forests and snow. They arrived in Prussia like a slow-moving storm, efficient, unrelenting, heavily armed, and convinced they were personally improving humanity one burned village at a time. Let's be honest, conversion was their polite word for conquest. For the next 50 years, the order fought the Prussians and various Baltic tribes in a seemingly endless cycle of raids, fort-building, forced baptisms, and uprisings. But in classic German fashion, they didn't just conquer, they organized. They divided lands into Komschirien, commanderies, each run like a small fortress state. Their castles weren't the decorative fairy tale kind. These were angular, brick-red monsters, complete with storage basements, chapels, armories, kitchens, and an unsettling sense of order. Everything inside was symmetrical. Everything had rules. Even eating was regimented. One person read scripture aloud, while others ate silently, because even meals were acts of devotion. And the knights didn't leave anything half-done. They built roads, ports, schools, and trading networks. It wasn't too long before Prussia turned from a pagan backwater into a thriving, Christianized province, where the locals quietly realized they had swapped tribal chiefs for colder, better-dressed overlords. Still, credit where it's due, the Teutonic Order turned inhospitable tundra into something resembling civilization. They drained bogs, established towns like Königsberg and Marienburg, and attracted settlers from Germany. Marienburg, today Malberg, in Poland, became their capital, a fortress so vast it feels more like a city in armor. Red brick walls wrapped around engines of administration. The Grand Master's residence sat above everything. a combination castle, monastery, and corporate headquarters. At Hitzait, it was the largest brick castle in the world, and yes, they tracked costs meticulously. Medieval budgets were their true weapon. But behind that facade of holy efficiency was a darker rhythm. The Northern Crusades were ruthless. Whole tribes were wiped out or relocated. Those who converted often did so under duress. Rebellions flared constantly, especially when the knights' taxation or piety got particularly unbearable. What's fascinating, though, is how well they justified it all to themselves. To the order, they weren't conquerors. They were instruments of divine order. Their discipline was their theology. Their expansion, God's plan. Every arrow loosed was technically a sermon. Meanwhile, Europe applauded. Popes blessed their wars. Emperors sent knights to join them. Nobles funded the campaigns, partly out of faith and partly because Baltic lands offered decent trade routes and less sunstroke than Jerusalem. By the mid-13th century, they were unstoppable. The old pagan tribes fell one by one, wrapped into the order's rigid administrative map. But all empires, no matter how well documented, come with cracks. And the Teutonic Knights were about to meet two immovable forces: local resistance from the newly Christianized but resentful populations, and the ever-prickly politics of neighboring Christian rulers, who inconveniently started noticing that the order wasn't exactly leaving. Let's float gently into that next, as the icy crusaders find themselves caught between kings, converts, and the first tremors of their own pride. Again. We're still in the north. Snow crunching under iron boots, rivers freezing into mirrors, and somewhere far in the distance, a monk knight, trying to read his prayer book with gloves on. Not ideal. When we last left off, the Teutonic Order had successfully set up shop in the Baltic. They'd gone from mercenary monks to full-blown landlords, running Prussia as both a holy project and a well-oiled bureaucracy. But as every empire eventually learns, it's one thing to conquer, it's another to keep people liking you afterward. By the mid-13th century, the Teutonic Knights had built something astonishing. Fortresses dotted the landscape like carefully placed chess pieces. Useful towns had German settlers. Everyone else had conversion sermons. Their rule blended piety with process annual audits, strict ranks, even standardized male routes. The Grand Master, a sort of warrior CEO, presided over it all. He lived in Marienburg, where brick walls were polished to quiet perfection and stairs echoed faintly with Gregorian chants. Meetings weren't spontaneous. They were scheduled. Reports weren't optional. They were required. It was, in many ways, a medieval dream of order. Except, of course, that no one particularly likes living under a dream that feels like a tax form. Let's drift into the politics. Around them were restless kings: Poland, Lithuania, Denmark, and the Holy Roman Empire, all juggling alliances, borders, and occasional passive-aggressive crusades. The knights had come north on invitation, yes, but like most invited guests, they overstayed. Their grip extended over Prussia and Livonia, and their ambitions crept toward more. Meanwhile, their original purpose, converting pagans, was nearing completion. Problem was, that left them with an awkward question. What now? A military order with no one left to fight feels like a very sharp tool looking for a new project. The neighboring pagan holdouts were dwindling. Only one large pagan state remained. Lithuania, and Lithuania, annoyingly, wasn't following the small tribe Italy conquered. The Grand Duchy of Lithuania in the 13th century was a rising power, fiercely independent, militarily nimble, and led by leaders who didn't much appreciate neighbors in white cloaks preaching with swords. What began was one of the longest, strangest wars in medieval Europe, the Northern Crusades in core performance. For roughly 150 years, the Teutonic Order waged near-continuous campaigns against Lithuania. Each year, new crusaders would arrive from across Europe: nobles, adventurers, sons seeking redemption, or, more honestly, bragging rights. They called these expeditions Reisen or journeys. Picture it like an annual corporate retreat, except with more fire and fewer refreshments. For the visiting knights, these journeys were almost a vacation. You came, fought pagans, earned your indulgences, and went home to talk about the glory. For the Teutonic Order, it was deadly serious. Each journey fortified their borders and justified their continued existence. And yet, Lithuania refused to fold. The knights might have had superior armor and logistics, but the Lithuanians knew their forests and fought guerrilla style. The tension simmered year after year, blowing hot and cold until finally, in a plot twist no one saw coming, Lithuania converted to Christianity in 1386. You'd think that would have been cause for celebration in The whole goal of the order was to convert pagans. Right. Mission accomplished. Except, no. The knights weren't thrilled, because a baptized Lithuania meant they suddenly had no divine mandate to attack, and they weren't ready to retire into monastic gardening just yet. You'd almost feel sorry for them. Centuries of crusading habits don't die. So they questioned the sincerity of Lithuania's conversion, implying that maybe it didn't count. How convened! What complicated things was Poland? In that same year, 1386, Lithuania's Grand Duke Jagila married Queen Jadwiga of Poland and became King Władysław II Jagiellon. A powerful Polish-Lithuanian alliance was born. And they weren't exactly charmed by Teutonic arrogance. From allies against pagans, the order had turned into awkward neighbors between two ambitious Christian states who were suddenly much stronger together. Now, anyone familiar with medieval history knows what comes next when powerful neighbors share borders, treaties that nobody reads, insults that everyone does, and long, icy silences that end in heavily armored disasters. But before we reach that point, let's peek inside the Order's world at its height. The 14th century was their golden age. If you like, your gold shaped into discipline and brickwork. Marienburg Castle was a marvel. Layers within layers. An outer bailey for guests and tailors, a middle bailey for supplies, and the high castle at the core, where the Grand Master and elite knights lived. The architecture mirrored hierarchy. Every arch whispered about order. Life inside was strictly timed. Morning prayers at dawn. Silent meals. No private ownership, not even of books. Everything belonged to the order. Lavishness was frowned upon, though naturally the entire fortress gleamed with craftsmanship that screamed lavish in all but name. When not fighting or praying, they managed trade, agriculture, and diplomacy. Their ports connected amber routes across the Baltic Sea. Their influence stretched to merchants from Lubeck to Riga. But beneath that polished facade loomed tension. Their lands were populated by native Prussians, Poles, and Lithuanians, who obeyed but didn't love them. Taxes were heavy. The knights' high ideals had hardened into bureaucracy. Even among their own ranks, idealism began routing into ego. Ambitious young knights came for adventure and glory, then found themselves counting grain inventories. Others took too mild corruption a favor here. A confiscated estate. Their humanity sneaks into even the strictest systems. Then came vanity projects, grand campaigns, to showcase relevance, some more costly than useful. The order had become, in essence, a medieval superpower trying to justify its empire after its mission was over. Poland and Lithuania saw it too, and began preparing to challenge it outright. By 1409, protests and raids along their borders spiraled into open war. The Teutonic Knights declared it their sacred duty to defend Christendom, a catchy line for what was quickly becoming territorial panic. The following year, both sides met near the village of Grunwald or Tannenberg, depending which side you asked. The Teutonic army gathered all its might. Heavily armored knights, disciplined ranks, artillery, and allies from across northern Europe. They were certain of victory. After all, this was their specialty, holy war in professional rhythm. But the battlefield isn't a monastery hall. Things fell apart fast. On July 15th, 1410, the Polish-Lithuanian forces outmaneuvered them, exhausted, overheated under their steel. The knights' impeccable discipline turned into confusion. The Grand Master, Ulrich von Gungingen, was killed in the chaos. Legend says he refused to retreat. dying with his standard still raised a symbol of stubborn pride more than strategic sense. The Teutonic army collapsed. Their banners fell, their long reputation for invincibility cracked with a single summer's battle. It was supposed to be their defining victory. Instead, it became the start of their decline. When word reached Marienburg, shock spread through the fortress halls. For decades, they had believed themselves God's chosen army. Now, they were just another defeated order. The Crusader dream froze in the Baltic air and never fully thawed again. But still, they weren't gone yet. They regrouped, rebuilt, negotiated peace. The fortress held, even as the aura of destiny dimmed. The century rolled on, and the world around them changed faster than they could adjust. Gunpowder and new states replaced the old feudal Crusader map. Kings had standing armies now, not vows of obedience. Nobility leaned on trade instead of tithes, and the Teutonic knights, impeccably devout and hopelessly administrative, were stuck trying to run a medieval order in a Renaissance world. Let's float into that twilight next, when faith turned into nostalgia, and the Teutonic Order quietly tried to survive its own relevance. All right, welcome back. You've made it through crusades, castles, and an unreasonable number of German knights trying to baptize entire forests. Now we're drifting into the quieter, colder chapters, the part where our ironclad monks start realizing they don't fit in their own century anymore. When we left off, the Teutonic Order had just been shattered at the Battle of Grunwald in 1410. It wasn't an immediate collapse, more like a slow, bureaucratic implosion stretched over 100 years, which, fittingly, is exactly how a group of monk accountants would fall apart after Grunwald. The order lost most of its confidence. They still held onto Marienburg Castle because even their enemies admitted it was nearly impossible to conquer. But the aura of holy invincibility was gone. They negotiated the first Peace of Thorn in 1411, which kept them technically independent, but forced them to pay massive reparations to Poland and Lithuania. That might not sound too bad, but in medieval economics, reparations usually come with two side effects: empty treasuries and bitter knights. To make things worse, resentment started bubbling among their own subjects. The Prussian towns, merchants, and nobles had grown tired of the order's iron discipline. They wanted trade freedom and less taxation. Basically, early capitalism knocking on a fortress door. The order, of course, couldn't imagine loosening control. Obedience was their identity. So when dissent rose in the 1450s, they clamped down. Bad move. The Prussian Confederation, a coalition of towns and nobles, asked Poland's king Casimir IV for help, and in 1454, the 13 Years' War began, one of those wars named after how long it dragged on and how few people actually wanted to fight it. The order fought fiercely, but exhaustion piled up. They sold off lands to pay mercenaries. They pawned relics, taxed farms, begged the Holy Roman Emperor for aid that mostly didn't come. By 1466, the inevitable happened. The Second Peace of Thorn split their world apart. Western Prussia, with all the nice ports and trade access, went to Poland. The eastern half stayed under the order's control. But now, as a vassal, yes, the once mighty Teutonic knights, conquerors of the north, were officially tenants. They had to kneel and swear fealty to the Polish crown. Imagine spending 3 centuries building castles to honor God's empire, only to end up filing paperwork under your former enemies. The humiliation must have been unbearable, though probably beautifully documented. But somehow, they endured. The order still existed, operating from Königsberg, its ranks thinner, but still respectable. They even kept up the appearance of spiritual mission, though in truth, they were drifting toward retirement. Then came the 16th century. The world had changed again. The Reformation thundered across Europe. Kings broke with Rome, and knights began wondering whether their vows still mattered. Enter Albrecht of Brandenburg, the Grand Master. During this critical moment, he was young, educated, and increasingly skeptical about maintaining a theocratic state in a century that had replaced relics with printing presses in 1525. He did something no Teutonic leader before him dared. He met with Martin Luther, The reformer advised him in characteristically blunt fashion to give up the vows, dissolve the order's rule in Prussia, and turn it into a secular duchy under Lutheran faith. And Albrecht agreed. That same year, he declared the order's state dissolved and transformed it into the Duchy of Prussia, the first Protestant state in Europe. He paid homage to the Polish king as a secular duke. Cue the outrage from the Catholic hierarchy. To them, the Teutonic Order had just committed institutional heresy. Their own Grand Master had gone rogue. But in hindsight, he'd done the only logical thing left. You can't run a medieval crusader theocracy in the age of humanism and gunpowder. The Teutonic Knights had finally met time and lost. Still, the order didn't die completely. The remnants regrouped in their German-speaking heartlands, holding minor territories under Habsburg protection in Austria and later Bohemia. They dropped the swords and leaned fully into their charitable monastic side again. Hospitals, religious houses, administration, the quieter callings they'd left centuries ago. Even their leadership faded from heroic to ceremonial. Grand Masters became more like administrators than warlords, usually Habsburg princes with too many titles already. The irony is almost poetic. The same order that had once built an empire of conquest out of prayer and discipline survived only by giving both back to the church. They returned to their origins, literally a hospital order, just no longer the militant kind. Meanwhile, their old lands moved on. The Duchy of Prussia, that offshoot born from their decline, eventually became a kingdom, under rulers who'd call themselves kings in Prussia. Centuries later, that kingdom would become the core of the modern German state. So, yes, the disciplined monks who catalogued Christian fortresses indirectly fathered Prussia, the militarized state, known for well-discipline and fortresses. History does love its callbacks. If you look at the timeline sideways, it's as if the order shed its vows, but left its personality behind to haunt Europe. But the story doesn't end in ashes. The Teutonic Order still exists. Technically, after a few centuries of obscurity, it evolved into a purely religious institution once again, headquartered in Vienna. Its members are now priests and lay brothers, running hospitals, schools, and charities. Their motto remains the same: Helfen voran, heilen, to help, to defend, to heal. There's something oddly calming about that. After all the fire, steel, and sanctimony, they return to where they began: compassion over conquest. And yet you can't walk through the ruins of Marienburg or the churches of Königsberg's memory without feeling the ghost of what they once were. The wind across the Baltic still passes through empty walls that once echoed with psalms and commands. If you could stand there, at dusk, under the same gray winter sky, you might hear the faint rhythm of boots on frozen ground, the echo of prayers whispered in Latin by men who believed they were building eternity. They weren't wrong entirely. Their fortresses still stand. Their paperwork is in every archive. Their myth-shaped nations. And when you read about Prussia's stern efficiency or Germany's later bureaucratic obsessions, there's a faint medieval ancestor smiling somewhere in the footnotes. A Teutonic knight with ink-stained fingers muttering a quiet amen. So, let's close here gently. From a hospital in Acre to an empire on the Baltic. From charity to conquest. From banners to files. The Teutonic Order rose on faith, drowned in politics, and resurfaced in duty. They tried to sanctify power, and power inevitably consumed them. But the discipline remained. Even in decline, they left behind a system that would quietly shape Europe's soul: precise, ordered, ironclad, and convinced that redemption could be measured in walls. Sleep well, the Crusades are over, the swords sheathed. The Baltic is quiet now, only the rustle of cold wind through old fortress corridors, and the memory of knights who mistook administration for salvation. Now let's drift back through the heat and dust of the ancient Mediterranean, where ambition looked like candlelight reflected on marble, and love, that dangerous world-shaping kind of love, to involve armies, gold, and at least one very bad political decision. This is the story of Mark Antony and Cleopatra, Rome's golden playboy and Egypt's last true pharaoh. Two people who mixed sex, strategy, and spectacular hubris into one of history's most expensive love affairs. So, dim the lights, maybe get comfortable, and prepare to fall slowly into an era where perfume was a weapon, and loyalty was just a coin waiting to flip. We begin in 41 BC, Rome in chaos mode, which, to be fair, was its resting state. The civil wars that followed Julius Caesar's assassination had divided the Republic into three nervous power blocks, known as the Second Triumvirate. At the top, Octavian, Caesar's ambitious heir. Marcus Lepidus, the forgettable one, and Mark Antony, general, politician, and professional hot mess. Antony was the kind of person history books describe using two opposite adjectives: brilliant and disastrous. A brilliant soldier, yes, he fought beside Caesar in Gaul and Egypt, but also disastrously impulsive. He had that rare talent of being both irresistible and exasperating in equal measure. People either followed him into battle or regretted meeting him after dinner. After Caesar's death in 44 BCE, Antony tried to be his natural successor, but Octavian, Caesar's quiet, pale, suspiciously calculating heir, had other ideas. For a while, they pretended cooperation, dividing up the Roman world to restore order. Antony got the East, Asia Minor, and the newly relevant Egypt. Octavian got the West, including Italy. They agreed not to kill each other, which in Roman politics was considered friendship. And this is where Cleopatra enters. Cleopatra Septimo Pilopator, Queen of Egypt, was already famous, infamous, and misunderstood all at once. She had reigned since 51 BCE, with a family tree that looked like a Mobius strip of sibling marriages. Cleopatra was queen by blood, survivor by instinct, and politician by default. Egypt at that point was technically independent, but functionally Rome's cash cow boot, humiliatingly wealthy, and always watched. She'd already had her first Roman entanglement with Julius Caesar, producing a child named Caesarion Little Caesar, who was both her hope for legitimacy and Rome's awkward family secret. After Caesar's death, she'd retreated to Alexandria to rule diplomatically, quietly, and at times ruthlessly. But Mark Antony was now in charge of Rome's eastern territories, and he needed Egypt's resources for campaigns against Parthia. Cleopatra knew exactly what that meant. He wasn't coming south for romance. He was coming for money, which made it the perfect time to fall in love. The first meeting is almost cinematic. In the summer of 41 BCE, Antony summoned Cleopatra to Tarsus, modern Turkey, to demand her loyalty and tribute. Every other local ruler had arrived humbly, probably gift baskets in hand. Cleopatra, however, did not do humble. According to historian she sailed up the Cydnus River in a golden barge with purple sails and silver oars, perfumed like a goddess and dressed as the goddess Isis herself. Attendants fanned her, musicians played, and incense drifted behind her like a scent that spelled you are not in control here. Antony, who loved theatrics almost as much as wine, was instantly enchanted. He invited her to dine. She countered, inviting him to her ship instead. And that was that. It's hard to blame him. Cleopatra was radiant and confident, fluent in several languages, including Egyptian, rare for her dynasty, educated in philosophy, mathematics, and political manipulation. She'd survived coups, childbirth, Roman invasions, and at least one assassination plot by her brother. Compared to Roman senators, she was probably the most competent adult Antony had ever met. Of course, there was also chemistry, and possibly ego. Cleopatra liked powerful men with military reputations. Antony liked women who made him feel like a demigod. Together, they created the ancient world's most chaotic power couple. Antony stayed in Egypt far longer than politically wise. Cleopatra threw feasts that bordered on myth. Gold dining couches, perfume fontaines, servants scattering rose petals in rooms high enough to choke on the smell. Plutarch claims she once bet Antony she could spend 10 million sesterces on one dinner, then dissolved a priceless pearl in vinegar and drank it. Historians debate the chemistry. What's certain is the symbolism. You can't outspend Egypt, she was saying. Meanwhile, in Rome, people noticed his alliance with Octavian was crumbling. Gossip spread. Mark Antony is bewitched, they said, enslaved by the Queen of the East. Which was ironic. given that these same senators spent their evenings hiring flute girls and complaining about Antony returned briefly to Rome in 40 BCE, mostly to do damage control and to marry Octavian's sister, Octavia Minor. It was a peace offering, a political marriage designed to glue the triumvirate back together. For about 3 years, he even behaved sword of. But Antony was restless in domestic life. His loyalty to Cleopatra never really faded. Eventually, after failing in a Parthian campaign, he retreated once again to Egypt, to her, and left poor Octavia stranded with their children in Rome. Scandal exploded. By 34 BCE, Antony and Cleopatra had gone fully public. He recognized their twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra. He openly lived with her as a consort. Together, they launched new ceremonies, parading as Dionysus and Isis through the streets of Alexandria. Rome, watching through clenched teeth, tried to call it propaganda, but it was more like high-level theater. The final straw came when Antony distributed eastern territories to Cleopatra as children, formalizing what Romans called the donations of Alexandria. To the Senate, it looked like he was dividing Rome's conquests into hereditary kingdoms controlled by a foreign queen. Octavian spun it as treason wrapped in seduction. Publicly, Antony's letters went quiet. Privately, Octavian's campaign of character assassination screamed. He secretly read Antony's supposed testament to the Senate, claiming Antony intended to make Alexandria his new capital and name Caesarion heir to Rome. No proof, but perfect gossip material. Antony's reputation sank in Rome as swiftly as Cleopatra's rose in Alexandria. By 32 BCE, it was inevitable. Political alliance had become personal vendetta. Octavian declared war not on Antony directly, but on Cleopatra, the corruption of the East embodied in one woman. Classic Roman optics. The coming war would be staged less like a military campaign and more like a moral judgment. Antony versus Rome was dangerous. Antony versus the Temptress Queen was patriotic theater. And somewhere in that, Antony probably still thought he could win. But history had already chosen a side. Let's drift slowly toward that last act, to Actium, where ambition met reality, and one of antiquity's greatest love stories drowned in its own perfection. Still awake. Good. Because now we're drifting to the edge of the ancient world too, the glittering shorelines of Greece, where the romance that shook empires slowly started to crack under its own mythology. It's 32 BCE. Mark Antony and Cleopatra have become inseparable, politically and otherwise. The East adored them. The West despised them. And Rome was having what can only be described as a moral panic. Octavian still not. Augustus yet was. Capitalizing on the outrage, his propaganda was surgical. Antony was no longer a Roman hero, but a lovesick traitor bewitched by an Egyptian queen. Cleopatra, to him, wasn't a ruler, she was a witch, a temptress. A foreign corrupter of Roman virtue. It was xenophobia, mixed with performance art. And it worked. Senators muttered about Eastern poets whispered about orgies and black magic. The Roman public, tired of civil wars, but hungry for a villain, decided they'd found one. Octavian finally declared war, officially not on Antony, but on Cleopatra, which, everyone understood, meant Antony, too. Back in Alexandria, the mood was quite different. Cleopatra was confident. She'd stocked Egypt's treasury, armed her navy, and convinced herself that Antony's legendary generalship could still outmaneuver Rome. Antony himself, likely exhausted, slightly paranoid, and pretending not to notice that his old allies kept defecting to Octavian. The lovers met the Roman fleet off the coast of western Greece, near a promontory called Actium. Picture the scene. June 31st BCE. The Ionian Sea shimmering under a punishing sun. Antony had about 500 ships massive. Showy? Slow? Octavian's Admiral Agrippa had fewer numbers, but lighter, faster vessels. And somewhere among Antony's fleet was Cleopatra's personal squadron, 60 Egyptian ships, gilded and elaborate. Less instruments of war than floating temples. The battle that followed was oddly anticlimactic. It wasn't a clash of steel so much as a burnout of morale. Wind conditions, miscommunication, and nerves unraveled the order of Antony's line. Agrippa's agile ships darted in and out, setting fire to heavier Roman galleys. Then came the most debated moment in ancient gossip. Cleopatra, whether by plan or panic, turned her fleet and sailed away toward open sea. Seeing her retreat, Antony followed, abandoning the rest of his forces mid-fight. To Octavian's men, it looked like betrayal wrapped in absurd romance, the general chasing the queen instead of victory. The rest of Antony's fleet collapsed. Soldiers surrendered aid. His remaining commanders switched sides. Actium was less a battle, more a slow motion, humiliation that ended with Antony and Cleopatra fleeing to Egypt with what little remained of their pride. From that moment, the clock started ticking. For a while, they kept up appearances. Alexandria still glittered. Court life went on, and both lovers pretended their empire hadn't just evaporated. Antony trained a new army. Swearing loyalty still bound them. Cleopatra secured her ships and sent envoys to negotiate. But politically, they were ghosts. Everyone knew it. Only they pretended not to. In one last attempt to bargain, Cleopatra sent word to Octavian, the same way all cornered rulers do. Through flattery, gold, and diplomacy, she offered to abdicate for Caesarion, her son, by Julius Caesar. Opin Caesar's bloodline would mean mercy. Octavian's replies were distant and chilly. Meanwhile, Antony spiraled. His allies in Greece were gone, his Roman titles stripped, and rumors claimed Octavian's envoys were secretly dealing with Cleopatra alone. Jealousy, pride, despair, the usual Roman hero ingredients, simmered into collapse. By the summer of 30 BCE, Octavian invaded Egypt. His forces marched swiftly along the Nile, defensive lines dissolving before them. Alexandria, the city that once dazzled Caesar, prepared for siege. Antony tried rallying his remaining troops, giving speeches about honor and Rome. But this was no longer the confident general who charged through Gaul. When defeat came, he barely resisted. And then, the scene everyone remembers, though less glamorous than legend paints it. Cleopatra fled to her mausoleum, her own tomb, already built, stocked with treasure, and sealed like a prophetic insurance policy. She locked herself inside and sent word that she was dead. When Antony heard, he broke. He fell on his sword. Not immediately. Foul romance could be dramatic, but inefficient. He was carried, bleeding, to Cleopatra's tomb, begging to see her one last time. Accounts differ on the style of their reunion. Some say soldiers tied ropes to haul him up through a window. Others say servants lifted him by hand. Either way, Antony died in her arms, reportedly telling her to live, to bargain wisely, to avoid falling into Octavian's hands. She promised she'd try. She probably didn't mean it. When Octavian entered the city, Cleopatra attempted diplomacy one last time. She met him, robed and adorned, but subdued. Classical sources claim he admired her charisma but saw through her performance. He wanted her alive for his triumphal parade in Rome. She knew exactly what that meant, being paraded in chains through the streets as a captured queen. So, sometime in August 30th BCE, the Queen of Egypt chose her ending. The details? Unclear. Ancient writers, always ready for poetry over truth, say she arranged a final banquet, kissed her children goodbye, and dismissed her servants. Then, an Aspan Egyptian kubru was smuggled in a basket among figs. She let it bite her. Quick, symbolic, mildly theatrical. Other accounts suggest poison applied with a needle or comb, maybe even gas. But Snake has the best branding, and history never ignores good branding. Her maids, Iras and Charmian, followed her into death. When soldiers found them, Charmian was arranging her mistress's crown. Octavian reportedly said, "Was this well done, Charmian?" And she replied, "It is well done, as befitting a descendant of kings." He ordered her buried beside Antony, and just like that, the age of Egyptian pharaohs ended. Octavian became Augustus, Rome's first emperor. Egypt became his personal province. The empire's jewel, Caesarion, Cleopatra's son, was quietly executed not long after. The other children of Antony and Cleopatra were raised by Octavia, Antony's Roman wife, in an act of cold but calculated mercy, and yet the legend of Antony and Cleopatra refused to die. Rome's poets, artists, and eventually playwrights wouldn't let it. They turned it into myth, a love story so excessive, so doomed, that it became irresistible. Let us drift through that legacy, a little the way their story outlived both of them and somehow turned tragedy into immortality. Because history, as usual, turned their private chaos into public theater. So here we are. The palace is silent, Rome is triumphant, and Egypt has fallen asleep under foreign rule. But Mark Antony and Cleopatra, in their final act, managed to become larger than any victory parade Octavian ever staged. Their story didn't end with their bodies being buried in Alexandria. It began there, in marble, ink, and whispers. Octavian had won. Yes, but public image mattered to him more than conquest. He spent years reshaping what people remembered. Antony became the tragic figure who'd lost his Roman virtue to an Egyptian queen. Cleopatra became the villain. Exotic, manipulative, deliciously dangerous. Everything Rome loved to fear about the East. And yet, history has a soft spot for scandal. Every century since has quietly rewritten the script. In the Roman version, Cleopatra was the serpent, the woman who corrupted Rome's finest soldier. In the Renaissance version, she became the lover who made death beautiful. By Shakespeare's time, she turned into poetry itself, witty, proud, defiant, and far too human for the marble world that condemned her. Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra gave them voices again, now softened with reflection. Antony became weary but noble, a tragic soldier caught between duty and love. Cleopatra, regal to the end, faced her death not with fear, but flair. "Give me my robe, put on my crown." Shakespeare imagined her saying, "I have immortal longings in me." It was fiction, of course, but sometimes fiction tells the truth more gently than facts do. Because whatever else, they were rulers, lovers, war strategists, egoists. Antony and Cleopatra refused to be ordinary. Even in self-destruction, they aimed for myth. They didn't start as soulmates. They began as two ambitious people who found mutual convenience wrapped in admiration, attraction, and, eventually, something closer to devotion. And maybe that's why their story still lingers. It's not about perfect romance. It's about imperfection, so grand it swallowed empires. After their deaths, Egypt became one of Rome's richest provinces. Augustus milked its grain and its imagery, adorning his coinage with conquered sphinx and laurels. He presented himself as the savior of the world from Eastern corruption, the calm after the storm. But one can't help noticing that centuries later, we still remember Antony and Cleopatra's names. We remember their faces, their chaos, their endings. Octavian, he became Augustus, a name revered and slightly boring. The lovers became eternal gossip, and gossip never dies. Let's travel forward for a moment. Through time, artists kept reimagining the pair. Medieval chroniclers illustrated Cleopatra as a serpent-clad temptress. Renaissance painters placed her in marble halls, pale and tragic. In the 19th century, she turned into a symbol of both female power and male downfall. Historians couldn't decide if she was feminist or fatal. Hollywood, of course, picked up the torch with glittering excess. The 1963 adaptation with Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton nearly bankrupted the studio, but it cemented their myth forever. Egyptian set pieces, diamonds the size of olives, all of it excessive, glorious, doomed. Just like the originals, but beneath the spectacle, something quieter endures. The way they defied what their worlds expected of them. Mark Antony could have been another faceless general. Cleopatra could have been a tolerated client queen. Instead, they became a story about people who made empires bend to their emotions, for better or worse. And that's the true epic fatalism of it all. The same passion that crowned them also destroyed them. For Rome, love should have been duty. For Egypt, politics meant devotion without attachment. They ignored both rules. So when we think about Cleopatra and Antony now, maybe they'll read less warnings and more mirrors, reminders that ambition and affection are rarely cleanly divided, and that sometimes the world punishes what it secretly envies. It's strange that out of everyone from that era, all the senators, generals, and philosophers, it's this pair that haunt the imagination. Cleopatra, brilliant and impossible. Antony, reckless and loyal to the end. Somewhere in the afterlife of history, they probably made peace with the way it turned out. Let's fade gently, then. Picture them as they were in that last moment. Two people surrounded by the ruins of everything they'd built, knowing that the story of their fall would outlive the city itself. The torches dim. The ships are gone. But the river of memory still glows beneath the night, full of gold, perfume, and echoes of voices refusing to be forgotten. Hey guys, if you've reached this video, thanks for listening. If stories like this calm you instead of keeping you up, gently tap that subscribe button and let history keep you company on quiet nights. Leave a comment telling me who you'd like to drift through next. Maybe Nero's Golden Palace or Catherine the Great's Diary of Disappointments. And if you're already half asleep, that's fine too. History's patient. It'll still be here when you wake up.